Hello, and welcome back to Best Sleep History. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Before we begin our journey together, go ahead and get comfortable. Adjust your pillows, settle into your blankets, and let yourself relax. Tonight, we're traveling back over 4,000 years to ancient Egypt to discover the real stories of the people who built one of the world's greatest wonders. You've probably heard a lot of myths about the pyramids. Tonight, we're going to set those aside and explore the truth, which is somehow even more fascinating. We'll meet the workers, the craftsmen, the families who lived and labored in the shadow of these magnificent monuments. Their story is one of skill, community, and daily life in a world so different from our own, yet in many ways, remarkably familiar. So close your eyes if you'd like, or let them rest gently on something nearby. Take a deep breath, and let's step back in time together. It's early morning at Gaza, around 2500 BCE, during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu. The sun is just beginning to rise over the eastern desert, painting the limestone cliffs in shades of pink and gold. In a village not far from the construction site, workers are beginning to stir. This village isn't a prison camp or a slave quarters. It's a carefully planned community, with streets laid out in neat rows, houses built of mud brick, and even a brewery and bakery that produce thousands of loaves and gallons of beer each day. Yes, beer. The workers received rations of beer as part of their payment, along with bread, meat, and vegetables. Let me introduce you to a man we'll call Hetepi. We don't know his exact name, but we know men like him lived and worked here. Hetepi is a stone mason, skilled in working the white Tura limestone that will give the pyramid its smooth, gleaming exterior. He's been working on the pyramid for 3 months now, as part of his labor obligation to the pharaoh. Something like a tax, but paid in work rather than goods. Hetepi wakes in his small house, where he lives with his wife and 2 young children. The house is simple but comfortable, with a main room, a smaller back room for sleeping, and a small courtyard where his wife prepares food. The walls are thick mud brick, keeping the house cool even in the intense Egyptian heat. His wife has already been to the village bakery to collect their daily ration of bread, 10 loaves, still warm, along with a portion of onions and a small amount of fish. Hetepi eats quickly, drinks some beer, weaker than what we might think of as beer today, more like liquid bread, and prepares for his day. Outside, the village is coming alive. Children run between houses, women gather at the communal ovens, and thousands of workers begin making their way toward the pyramid construction site, just as the sun fully breaks over the horizon. Now let's pause here for a moment and talk about something important, something that historians got wrong for a very long time. The pyramids were not built by slaves. This is one of the most persistent myths about ancient Egypt. But archaeological evidence has definitively proven it false. The workers who built the pyramids were paid laborers, farmers who worked during the flood season when their fields were underwater, skilled craftsmen who worked year-round, and teams who took great pride in their work. We know this from several sources. First, we found the workers' villages, with their houses, bakeries, breweries, and even a cemetery, where workers were buried with honor. We found graffiti left by work gangs, giving themselves names like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkaura. These were teams that competed with each other, taking pride in their speed and skill. Second, we found the remains of the workers themselves. Their bones show signs of hard labor, yes, but also signs of medical care. Broken bones that healed, suggesting they received treatment, and their diet, while simple, was remarkably good. They ate meat regularly, much more than the average Egyptian farmer. The organization required to build the pyramids was extraordinary. Imagine coordinating tens of thousands of workers, quarrying millions of stones, transporting them, lifting them into place, all without modern machinery, without computers, without even iron tools. The Egyptians managed it through careful planning and a social structure that allowed them to mobilize their entire society for brief periods each year. During the Nile flood season, when farming was impossible, workers came from all over Egypt to contribute to the pharaoh's eternal monument. Let's return to Hatupai and see how this organization worked in practice. Hatupai walks with his work gang, a group of about 20 men he's been working with for these 3 months. They call themselves the Enduring Ones, a name they're rather proud of. As they approach the pyramid, the scale of it is breathtaking. Even unfinished, Khufu's pyramid already dominates the landscape. The core is nearly complete. Over 2 million limestone blocks, each weighing about 2.5 tons, stacked in careful layers that step up toward the sky. Now comes the detailed work, the outer casing of fine white limestone from Tura across the Nile, which will give the pyramid its smooth, gleaming finish. Hetupai's gang is assigned to the northern face today. They'll be fitting casing stones, each one cut to precise angles so they fit together seamlessly. This is skilled work, requiring patience and expertise. The stones arrive on wooden sledges, pulled by teams of workers along roads made slick with water. You might have seen drawings of thousands of workers pulling stones up enormous ramps. And there were ramps, yes, but probably not one straight ramp up the side. More likely, a series of smaller ramps that spiraled around the pyramid, or were reconfigured as the pyramid grew taller. Hetupai and his team use copper tools, saws, chisels, and wooden mallets. Copper is soft compared to iron, but it's effective, especially when used with sand as an abrasive. They work carefully, measuring and remeasuring, because once the stone is in place, moving it would be extraordinarily difficult. The work is hard, but it has a rhythm to it. The gang works together, calling out timing for their movements, singing work songs that help coordinate their efforts. Every so often, an overseer comes by, not to whip them as movies might show, but to check on progress, to bring water, to discuss technical problems. Around midday, work stops. It's too hot to continue safely. The workers retreat to shaded areas where they eat and rest. Bread, onions, beer. Sometimes there's meat, beef or mutton. The workers eat well because the pharaoh needs them strong and healthy. This isn't kindness exactly. It's practical management. A well-fed workforce is an efficient workforce. As they rest, Hatipi and his friends talk. They discuss their families, their villages, the progress of the pyramid. Some of the men have been here for years, full-time workers who've learned to read and write, who've been promoted to supervisors. They tell stories of the pharaoh, who occasionally visits the site, inspecting the work on his eternal resting place. After a few hours, as the sun begins its descent, work resumes. The afternoon shift is shorter, and as evening approaches, the workers begin to pack up their tools. Another day of progress, another few stones perfectly placed. Hetepi walks back to the village, tired but satisfied. His work will last forever, or so he believes, and in a way, he's right. Let's spend a little more time in the workers' village, because this is where we really get to know the people behind the pyramids. The village at Giza housed perhaps 4,000 workers at a time, along with their families and the support staff who kept everything running. There were bakers, brewers, doctors, priests, administrators, a whole community dedicated to the pyramid project. The houses were small but well built. Most had a main living area, a sleeping area, and sometimes a second story for storage or additional rooms. Families cooked in courtyards, where they'd also keep a few animals, goats perhaps, or chickens. Children played in the streets, much as children always have. They made toys from clay and wood, dolls, balls, carved animals. They helped with chores, learned from their parents, and sometimes attended schools where they learned to read and write, if their parents could afford it. Women worked too, though their work was different from the men's. Some worked in the bakeries and breweries, essential jobs that required skill and knowledge. Others wove cloth, made pottery, or worked as midwives and healers. The idea that ancient Egyptian women lived secluded lives is another myth. They had more rights and freedoms than women in many later civilizations. In the evenings, after work, the village came alive in a different way. Families gathered for meals. Friends met to talk and drink beer. Musicians played. We've found flutes, harps, and drums in archaeological sites from this period. People sang and danced and told stories. There was a strong sense of community here. These workers were building something magnificent together, something that would outlast them all. They knew it, and it gave their work meaning. We've even found evidence of disputes and their resolutions, legal documents written on pottery shards, recording arguments about property, marriage, debts. The workers had access to a justice system. They could bring complaints. They weren't slaves, powerless and nameless. They were people with lives, families, rights. Now, let's talk about how they actually did it. How did they move and place millions of tons of stone with such precision? First, the quarrying. Most of the pyramid's core blocks came from quarries right near the Giza Plateau. Workers would cut channels around a block of limestone, separating it from the bedrock. They used copper tools and wooden wedges. Sometimes they'd soak the wooden wedges in water, and as the wood expanded, it would crack the stone along natural fault lines. Once a block was free, it was shaped roughly at the quarry to reduce the weight that needed to be moved. Then came the transportation. The Egyptians were masters of moving heavy objects. They used wooden sledges and rollers, and they discovered that wetting the sand in front of the sledge reduced friction dramatically. Experiments have confirmed that this technique cuts the force needed to pull the sledge roughly in half. For the casing stones, the fine white limestone from Tura, the process was more complex. These stones had to be transported across the Nile, likely during the flood season when the water level was high and boats could come close to the construction site. Each casing stone was carefully cut to precise angles, so that when placed, they'd form the pyramid's smooth outer surface. Lifting the stones was perhaps the greatest challenge. The ramps we mentioned earlier were probably made of mud, brick, and rubble, materials that could be disassembled and reused as the pyramid grew. Teams of workers would haul stones up these ramps using ropes and wooden sledges. There's also evidence of lever systems, wooden levers that could lift a stone just enough to slip supporting blocks underneath, raising it gradually. This would have been especially useful for the final placement and adjustment of stones. The precision is what's most remarkable. The base of the Great Pyramid is level to within a few centimeters across a span of over 200 meters. The sides are aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal directions: north, south, east, west. This required sophisticated surveying techniques using the stars, the sun, and careful measurement. The Egyptians didn't have our technology, but they had time, patience, and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. They had skilled workers who took pride in their craft, and they had a society organized enough to sustain such projects for decades. Why? Why pour so much effort into building a tomb? To understand this, we need to understand how the ancient Egyptians viewed death and the afterlife. Death, to them, was not an ending. It was a transition. The pharaoh, especially, was not just a king. He was a god on earth, the intermediary between the human and divine realms. When the pharaoh died, he would join the gods in the heavens, and his divine power would continue to protect Egypt. But for this transition to work, the pharaoh's body had to be preserved, and his spirit had to have a place to dwell. This is where the pyramid came in. The pyramid was more than a tomb. It was a machine for resurrection, a carefully designed structure that aligned with the stars and the sun, channeling cosmic energies to transform the dead pharaoh into an eternal being. Inside the pyramid, the pharaoh's mummified body would rest in a stone sarcophagus, surrounded by texts and images meant to guide him through the afterlife. The pyramid's passages were oriented towards specific stars, particularly the circumpolar stars that never set, symbolizing eternity. For the workers, building the pyramid was an act of piety, a way to ensure the pharaoh's successful transition, and by extension, the continued prosperity of Egypt. It was also a way to participate in something eternal. The worker who carved his name into a hidden stone, or who placed a protective amulet into the mortar, was leaving his mark on eternity. This belief gave meaning to the enormous effort required. It wasn't just about moving stones. It was about building a stairway to heaven, ensuring cosmic order, securing the future. And there was pride, too. Pride in being part of the greatest construction project the world had ever seen. Pride in the skill it took to cut and place stones with such precision. Pride in the work gangs with their competitive names and their graffiti boasting of their accomplishments. Part 7. The completion and legacy. Let's imagine now that we've moved forward in time. It's been over 20 years since construction began. Pharaoh Khufu has died, and his pyramid is complete. The outer casing stones gleam brilliant white in the sun, polished so smooth you could see your reflection. The capstone, covered in gold or electrum, an alloy of gold and silver, sits at the very top, catching the first and last light of each day. The pyramid stands 146 meters tall, the tallest structure in the world, a position it would hold for over 3,800 years. It dominates the landscape, visible for miles in every direction. Hitepi, if he's still alive, might visit on a festival day. He's an old man now, his hands worn from decades of work. He might bring his grandchildren and point to a section of the pyramid saying, "I worked on that face. Our gang placed those stones." And his grandchildren, looking up at the immense structure, would understand that their grandfather was part of something magnificent. The pyramid becomes a focal point for Egyptian civilization. Other pharaohs build their own pyramids nearby, creating the necropolis at Giza. The site becomes a center of religious activity, with priests maintaining the pharaoh's cult, ensuring his spirit receives offerings for eternity. Centuries pass, millennia, empires rise and fall. The Greeks come and marvel at the pyramids. The Romans come, and the pyramids are already ancient beyond their reckoning. Arab scholars study them in the Middle Ages, developing theories about how they were built. The white casing stones are eventually stripped away, reused in Cairo's buildings after an earthquake in the 14th century. But the core remains, weathered but enduring. In modern times, archaeologists begin to uncover the truth about who built the pyramids. They find the workers' villages. They find the bakeries that fed thousands. They find the graffiti and the tombs and the evidence of a complex, organized society capable of extraordinary achievements. The myth of slaves building the pyramids is finally put to rest, replaced by a more accurate and somehow more inspiring story of skilled workers, organized labor, religious devotion, and human ingenuity. And so, we come to the end of our journey tonight. We've walked with the workers of ancient Egypt, seen the pyramids through their eyes, understood the skill and belief that made such monuments possible. The next time you see an image of the pyramids, remember Hatepi and his work gang, the enduring ones. Remember the bakers and brewers who fed thousands. Remember the children playing in the workers' village, the families who made this place a community. The pyramids endure because they were built with skill, with care, with pride. They stand as a testament not just to the pharaohs who commissioned them, but to the thousands of workers whose names we'll never know, who left their mark on eternity. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let yourself feel connected to that ancient world, to those ancient people who were, in so many ways, not so different from us. They worked and loved and raised families. They took pride in their crafts. They looked up at the stars and wondered about eternity, and they built something that would outlast them all. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time for another journey through history. Good night.